Germany, 1941. In just a few weeks, Hitler has defeated France. His occupation now spans half of Europe. He is at the peak of his glory. A woman from Berlin, Miss Dagmar Dassel, sends a letter to Adolf Hitler. She writes, "Mein Führer, the noblest, most brilliant of all men, prayed for and divinely sent, the savior of peace, the first soldier, the most brilliant of generals, the greatest strategist of all times, the most outstanding statesman. Hitler has the German people on his side, but the German people do not yet know that he will unleash the apocalypse." From one speech to the next, Hitler has openly expressed his hatred of the Slavs and his desire to destroy the Soviet Union, as Communist Russia was known at the time. Hitler wants to conquer the East to give the Germans what he refers to as Lebensraum, living space. For this living space, he looks towards the vast Soviet territory. It is a nation of 200 million human beings, presented in communist propaganda as happy in their kolkhozes or collective farms, when in fact, they are terrorized by a bloodthirsty dictator, Stalin. Neither Vyacheslav at the People's Commissary for Defense, nor Stalin, nor Molotov in Foreign Affairs considers himself ready to confront Hitler. To stall for time, in August 1939, the communist leaders had signed a non-aggression treaty with Hitler, who wanted to avoid a second front in the East. But Stalin believes Hitler will attack him one day. He says, "Hitler thinks he's outsmarted me, but actually, it's I who will trick him." Stalin does not want an enemy in the East, in Siberia. He wants a non-aggression pact with Japan, Hitler's ally in what is known as the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis. In Moscow, April 13th, 1941, the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yosuke Matsuoka, comes to sign this pact with the Soviet Union. Tokyo doesn't want to be at war with the Russians. Japan is preparing her attack against the Americans. Matsuoka has orders to be friendly to Stalin. In an extraordinary show of familiarity, they stand arm in arm. When Matsuoka leaves, Stalin literally puts on a show for Hitler on the platform of the train station. On April 20th, 1941, the Führer celebrates his 52nd birthday. Bormann, Speer and Schob, and Goering display opportunistic optimism. Some doubt Germany's ability to defeat Russia, but Hitler tells them, "I'll hear no more about it." The most reluctant voices are military men, like Marshal von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, or Admiral Raeder, head of the naval command. Many recall Napoleon, who lost his empire in the Russian snow. Hitler will need all his soldiers, even those in France who are relishing in their victory. In the spring of 1941, Hitler assembles his great army. 3 million German soldiers and 700,000 men from countries allied with the Reich, including Romania and Hungary, Slovakia and Croatia. 200,000 Finns will resume their fight against Russia, 60,000 Italians, and even 45,000 Spaniards, a disappointing number for Hitler, who had tried to convince Franco to get more involved in the war. At least Mussolini remains an ally, who has just suffered serious defeats in Albania and Greece. Hitler had to come to his rescue, wasting time, men, and equipment. To save Mussolini, Hitler occupies Greece, then Yugoslavia, but in doing so, he also secures the oil he so badly needs, produced by his ally, Romania. For Hitler, England is no longer a threat. The country is weakened and starved by the submarine war, and he can no longer continue to ally himself with his worst enemy, Stalin. He schedules the offensive against the Soviet Union for June 22nd and gives it a code name, Operation Barbarossa, after a great German emperor. Hitler declares, "When Barbarossa commences, the world will hold its breath." Hitler imposes on his high command, Keitel and Jodl, a dispersion of troops. To the north, towards Leningrad, to secure the Baltic. In the center, near Moscow, to bring down the communist regime. To the south, towards Kiev, and even further south, around Baku and its oil. Hitler so desperately needs this oil for his motorized army. He has neither doubt nor fear. Hitler lines up cannons and tanks. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, writes in his diary, "So far as personnel and equipment are concerned, Russia cannot compare with our force. The enemy will be driven back in one smooth movement. The Führer estimates that the operation will take 4 months. I reckon on fewer. We face victories unequaled in human history." Hitler's pilots, who are all 20 years old and members of the Hitler Youth, know nothing but Nazi dogma. They fly the Luftwaffe's 3,000 aircraft, and despite the losses in the Battle of Britain, their faith in the Führer remains intact. All the soldiers have faith in Hitler. They have all sworn allegiance to him. "I swear by God that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler." In Alsace-Moselle, annexed to the Reich after the French defeat of 1940, the local men are incorporated into the German forces against their will. They will be nicknamed the Malgré Nous, meaning despite ourselves. They risk being thrown into the Nazi-Villa Stutthof, the terrible Nazi concentration camp that has just been set up outside Strasbourg. 2,000 of them are forcibly integrated into the SS. Heinrich Himmler, the head of this criminal organization, makes them take an oath to Hitler. The children of Alsace-Moselle join the Hitler Youth. Women are also mobilized. Many are volunteers. Hitler is always eager to meet women. He charms them with his voice, warm and smooth when he's not shouting. One of these Alsatian Malgré Nous, filmed by his parents, is André Müller, 19 years old, from Mulsheim, a medical student who is assigned as a nurse to an infantry division heading east. What awaits him on the other side? Russian soldiers. There are 3 million of them. The Germans call them Untermensch, inferior people. Everything is dismissed and underestimated by the German intelligence service. The Red Army has been massively armed at the cost of great sacrifice. However, Stalin has disorganized it. Consumed with paranoia, he has just killed 600,000 people in the Great Terror. He had the high command marshals and regiment's colonels assassinated and sent thousands of officers to the Gulag, the Soviet concentration camps. Even in June, Stalin continues to receive countless warnings from his spies. On the eve of the German attack, a Wehrmacht soldier deserts to warn the Russians. Stalin says, "Shoot him." On Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, at 3 a.m., without a declaration of war, the Barbarossa plan goes into action. Hitler chooses to attack on a Sunday, a day of lesser vigilance. The German vanguards overrun the Russian defenses. The Wehrmacht's armored panzer divisions move deep into Soviet territory. One of the soldiers writes, "To the left and right of us along the road we follow, there are Russian corpses and burned out tanks pierced by shells. The charred bodies of the crew are still inside." Luftwaffe planes wipe out most of the Soviet fleet. Nearly 4,000 planes are destroyed on the ground or shot down in flight. The Germans control the skies since the first day of the attack. The Stuka dive bombers and their terrible warning sirens spread terror and devastation as they had done in France a year earlier. The Soviet soldiers are panic-stricken. Among them is Vasily Grossman, a great Russian writer. For him, June 22nd, 1941, is a sign of things to come. He writes, "These initial battles were waged with a cruelty that would mark the entire confrontation between these two evil empires. Hitler, meanwhile, follows Barbarossa's stunning progress from the Reich's new chancellery, which cost a colossal sum of money. Hitler wanted his architect Albert Speer and his favorite sculptor Arno Breker to design this vainglorious building with allegories of the Nazi Party and the army. After going through endless corridors and monumental doors, the heads of state must walk 150 yards across slippery marble to reach the Führer's immense office. A year ago to this day, on June 22nd, 1940, the French armistice had been Hitler's greatest victory to date. At that moment, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill speaks on BBC Radio. He says,
"Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder. not content with having all Europe under his heel, or else terrorized into various forms of abject submission, he must now carry his work of butchery and desolation among the vast multitudes of Russia.
On June 22, 1941, the Germans break through the weak Russian resistance and advance along the enormous front. The largest of all time, from the White Sea to the Black Sea. It is Sunday in Moscow. The capital is quiet. The Kremlin is empty. Where is Stalin? In this regime, everything is hidden, especially the panic of the Soviet government. Stalin is hidden away in his dacha, his secret country house. At first, he is devastated, unable to react. The great Stalin is afraid of being indicted and executed. As the German army advances, Stalin's effigies are destroyed by the Balts and Ukrainians, who welcome the Germans as liberators from Stalin's terror. Here they are, running out in front of the tanks, holding flowers. Zina Gurskaya is 7 years old. She recounts, "I saw my first German up close. He was tall, with blue eyes. He took my breath away. So handsome. And he kills." A young Ukrainian girl writes, "They ride in trucks covered with birch branches, just like what we do for weddings. They look like normal people. According to rumor, they're setting fires. Yet they simply ride by, laughing." An officer of the Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment, which had massacred the Senegalese infantrymen in France, writes, "We could sense their fear. But most of them applauded us. They shouted to us that we were liberating them." After the attack on June 24th, Hitler takes his famous personal train, where he has his meeting room, a bedroom, bathroom, and incredible means of communication for his aides de camp. A section of elite soldiers and anti-aircraft weapons ensure his protection. He constantly tries to justify his criminal acts. He says, "We have no obligation to the Russians. There's only one duty, to Germanize the country by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins." Hitler will move to his new headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, as close as possible to the Russian front. The Wolf's Lair, the Wolf's Ravine, the Werewolf. Hitler chooses code names using the word wolf, reminiscent of a pseudonym in Nazism's early days, Mr. Wolf. Eva Braun is far away with his wolf dog. A train station is constructed at the Wolf's Lair. It is connected to a track surrounded by fake trees and a minefield. A dozen block houses with steel doors house the high command. Hitler's quarters are relatively Spartan. But he can still have his tea and cakes at 4 p.m. Hitler, a staunch vegetarian, never drinks alcohol. But the ministers, marshals, and guests appreciate the champagne offered by Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a former representative of a champagne house. Hitler hates this place. Although perfectly camouflaged, it is built on marshland to absorb bomb impact, which makes it damp and unhealthy. Hitler, who suffered in the trenches during the First World War, cannot stand it. But news of Barbarossa gets better with each passing hour. He appoints a minister for the territories already occupied in the east. Alfred Rosenberg is a theorist firmly opposed to Bolshevism. Hitler wants the land, not the people. He says, "This is a war of extermination." He repeats to his generals, "Forget the concept of comradeship among soldiers. A communist is not a comrade, neither before nor after the battle. Yes, this is a war of extermination." Hitler gives orders to capture and kill the political commissars, spreading Stalin's word throughout the Soviet units. And immediately, the hunt for the Jews begins. If they are circumcised, they are hung. Along with the yellow star, this intimate sign of Jewishness is perversely exposed. Thus, the immense massacre that begins on June 22, 1941, is not carried out solely by specialized units, the Einsatzgruppen. The soldiers of the German army also participate. Italian author Malaparte, a war correspondent at the time, seeks to understand this in his book Kaputt. The German has no fear of the strong man, who faces him with courage. The German fears the defenseless, the weak, and the sick. That which drives the German to cruelty, to deeds most coldly, methodically, and scientifically cruel, is fear. Fear of the oppressed, the elderly, the women, and the Jews. The Wehrmacht's brutality quickly turns against the Germans and mobilizes the Russians. This popular upsurge brings the Soviet people closer to its regime, whose will, until now, was only imposed through terror. A peasant girl from the Smolensk region, Elena Kovalevskaya, 18, immediately enlists. She explains, "I felt instant hatred, immediately. Terrible hatred. How dare they tread on our land? Who are they? Where did they come from? I had only hatred in my heart. The fervor was raging inside me. I left. Mother stayed home alone with the cow. Everyone chants the sacred war. They're inspired by the heroic resistance of Brest-Litovsk, the besieged fortress on the road to Moscow. Here, Hitler's soldiers must confront NKVD troops, police officers, and tough guys, all entrenched in the citadel. They hold out for days, slowing down Operation Barbarossa. Moscow, Stalin returns to the Kremlin. How can he turn this situation around? First, he wants to reassure the whole world, taking advantage of the presence in Moscow of a famous American photographer, Margaret Burke White. He summons her to the Kremlin. These historical pictures will not be published. At the time, America considers Stalin to be one of the dictators of Europe. It isn't until 1943, once he has become an indispensable, therefore respectable ally, that Life magazine honors him on its cover. But in 1941, Margaret Burke White, filmed by the Soviet news cameras, seems impressed, yet cautious.
My most remarkable day since I have been here was the day that I went to the Kremlin to photograph Stalin. And I saw before me a very unpretentious-looking man, rather short, and with a face so serious that I almost thought it was carved out of granite until he smiled. And then I was surprised by the amount of charm and humor in his smile.
But Stalin is still Stalin. His repression gets worse. He has military tribunals. All those who have backed down are shot en masse, despite their desperate explanations. Stalin has officers executed, including the commander, General Pavlov, accused of cowardice. The families are deported to concentration camps, the horrific gulags. Stalin gives the scorched earth order like the Tsar against Napoleon. The Wehrmacht, like the Grande Armée, will find nothing on its path, neither livestock, nor food, nor shelter. Hitler's soldiers, enraged, set fire to what little remains. The German advance continues with worrying signs. The unbearable heat of this continental climate. The dust from the roads, which are more like paths, unsuitable for large motorized units. Fuel transport is a nightmare. The men must be moved across immense distances along with all the necessities. Spare parts, ammunition, food, and above all, drinking water. Hitler's generals want to make it quickly to Moscow, blowing through the defenses of Minsk and Smolensk, and encircling the trapped Soviet armies. Combats from July 9th to the 18th of 1941 are increasingly violent. August von Kaganek, a young lieutenant leading the attack in an armed reconnaissance vehicle, is in trouble. He says, "The Russians fight well, but in disarray. Their tanks are inferior to our panzers. Our Air Force discourages them. Occasionally, their planes venture out to attack us, but they're quickly shot down." Thousands of Soviets surrender in the ruins of Smolensk. And how many Russian soldiers have deserted? The commander-in-chief of the German Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, writes, "My automobile drives by an endless line of these wretches, crushed by fatigue and hunger. The sight of tens of thousands of Russian prisoners from Smolensk leaves me with a horrific impression. Some collapse from battle wounds. Hitler lets his prisoners starve to death, millions of them. He said he would, and he did. But this war crime will also fuel Soviet resistance. The Red Army demonstrates its astonishing ability to rebuild. Stalin has decided to sacrifice the Russians to save Russia and his hide. Groups of partisans with the peasants and workers harass and sabotage the Germans behind the lines. All take this oath. I swear to be brave, disciplined, and willing, without mercy for the enemy. They're equally merciless towards the traitors, whom they hang, shouting, "Down with fascist snakes." Lieutenant von Kaganeck writes, "We knew that we were fighting a battle to the death, with very little hope of escape. A ruthless war awaited us. Hitler will now confront his generals who disagree with him. He wants to stop the offensive on Moscow, to encircle the Russians in front of Kiev. Field Marshal von Bock and the renowned General Guderian try again to convince Hitler not to disperse his forces. Guderian later writes, "This was Hitler's greatest mistake." Guderian and his command 4x4 marked with his initial G. Like his entire army, takes off towards Kiev with his panzers. His nickname is Schnelle Heinz, Fast Heinz. His supplies are slow to follow, especially drinking water. His soldiers who drink anything are sick with dysentery. The entire Wehrmacht has dysentery. Even Hitler is plagued by violent attacks of diarrhea. Hitler has insomnia and painful migraines and high blood pressure. His doctor claims it's psychosomatic. Could the weight of the war be too much for Mr. Wolf? At the Wolf's lair, the Duce's special train rolls in. The Fuhrer always seems happy to see his ally. The news deserves a smile, but Hitler presents his condolences to Mussolini, who has just lost his son, a bomber pilot, killed in an accident. To cheer him up, Hitler organizes a sightseeing trip to the ruins of the Brest-Litovsk fortress, part of which is still off limits. Clearly happy, Hitler shows off the seized equipment. The unfortunate Italians have already been sacrificed in the sands of the Libyan desert. The Italian soldiers hate the Germans who look down on them. They are now prisoners of the British, who send them far away from fascist Italy to Canada. Hitler had sent the tanks of the Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, the Nazi general and a propaganda idol, to Libya, to launch an offensive towards Egypt and the Suez Canal during the Russian advance towards the Caucasus, in a great pincer strategy. Hitler triumphs on the Eastern Front. He shows Mussolini that against the advice of his generals, by temporarily abandoning Moscow and diverting Guderian's troops, he captured 4 Russian armies in the greatest encirclement in history. Guderian now has 400,000 Russian prisoners on his hands. They're already famished. General Guderian attacks the last Russian defenses around Kiev. Capturing the Ukrainian capital delays the Germans' main objective, the road to Moscow, by a month. On September 19, 1941, Guderian enters Kiev, and the German propaganda shows the entire world the extent of Hitler's new victory. German newsreels highlight the Ukrainian people's resentment against Stalin and the active support for Nazism from some. Yet most of the population is appalled, as witnessed by Vasily Grossman in his war diaries. He writes, "They cry. As soon as they start to speak, they cry. And you want to cry in spite of yourself. What a tragedy." On September 29th, 30,000 Jews are directed to a ravine which separates 2 districts of Kiev, called Babi Yar, the Old Women's Ravine. Thousands of them, with their children, are stripped of their clothes, which will be sold. German Lieutenant Horst Pils witnesses the massacre of these innocent people. He writes, "I saw how the children's little heads exploded. The Jews who were to be executed afterwards were also forced to see this. We heard terrible moans, prayers, and wails. The children screamed and cried the loudest. How could men do this? Tens and tens of thousands were killed in just a few days in Babi Yar, Lubny, Minsk, and 100 other places of torture. 1.5 million men, women, elderly, and children are killed in this Holocaust by bullets, until the Nazi leaders decide that it's going too slowly and using too much ammunition. The extermination camps, gas chambers, crematoriums, and 6 million victims will soon follow." Private Hermann Gieschen, a photographer with Infantry Division 105, writes to his wife, "The Jews are being completely eradicated. Dear Hannah, don't think about it too much. It must be done." How could Hitler instill such hatred and violence in his troops? St. Petersburg, the name of the Tsar's former capital, was changed to Leningrad after Lenin, communism's guide. The city had retained the charm of the old Russia until the arrival of the Germans. Stalin has mobilized its terrorized population, caught between his ruthless police and the German scourge. Day and night, women and children, young and old, frantically digged miles of anti-tank ditches around the city. But the Russians are unable to stop the Germans, who soon reached the city's gates. Just as in a distant past, when the Teutonic Knights had arrived in the east, and the savior of the Slavs was named Alexander Nevsky. Centuries later, in 1941, it's the brilliant Russian general Georgy Zhukov who succeeds in containing the German advance. But Zhukov can't prevent the Germans from closing in on Leningrad. These wives of Russian soldiers do not yet know that they're about to live through an ordeal, which will be hidden for 3 years so as not to demoralize the Soviet people. Rare images that were shown throughout the country give the impression of a normal life. But the famine, which pushes hundreds of these unfortunate people to cannibalism, and the terrible cold of winters without heating, will result in 1 million victims. 3 months after the start of Operation Barbarossa, Western Russia is occupied by the Germans. Stalin has ordered the emergency evacuation of 1,500 factories, a massive undertaking involving thousands of wagons and the relocation of workers. But since all men are at the front, the workers are primarily women. Tatiana Makrova recounts, "We were immediately sent to factories that did not yet have a roof. We worked 10 hours a day without a single break, and with only 300 grams of bread. Tatiana must produce 10 times, 100 times more ammunition for what the Russians now call the Great Patriotic War." In Moscow, anti-aircraft balloons appear in the sky, along with the barricades of despair. In the Kremlin, doubt settles in. Stalin then raises the idea of a negotiated peace, like in 1918. Hitler hesitates. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht are exhausted. Will Hitler stop? No, Hitler treads on. On October 3rd, 1941, he proclaims, "Today, I can say that this enemy is already broken and will never rise again." The anthem rings out, "Germany, Germany above all." Just how far will Hitler take Germany?